Rain hammered the pavement of downtown Chicago in cold, relentless sheets, and Amara Voss ran through it barefoot. Her heels abandoned 3 blocks ago when they had snapped and slowed her down. Her breath tore out of her in ragged clouds, her chest burning, her mind screaming one single word: run. Behind her, somewhere in the maze of wet alleys and flickering streetlights, she could still hear them, the heavy, unhurried footsteps of the 2 men her fiancé had sent to bring her back. Not because he loved her. Because she was collateral, a signature on a contract, a body worth more to him unmarried and untouched than she would ever be worth as a person he actually wanted. She had left the rehearsal dinner an hour ago, slipping out through the kitchen of the restaurant while her future mother-in-law toasted to a wedding that was never supposed to happen. Desmond Cole was not a man anyone said no to. He owned half the real estate on the north side and a piece of every alderman who mattered, and marrying his father's business partner's daughter had been decided over cigars long before Amara had any say in her own future. She had smiled for 2 years. She had worn the ring. She had told herself that safety was worth swallowing her own voice, until 3 nights ago when she overheard Desmond on the phone, laughing about the insurance policy he'd taken out in her name, and the accident he was already planning for after the honeymoon. She turned a corner into a narrower street, her lungs on fire, and skidded to a stop. Dead end. A brick wall rose in front of her, slick with rain, and behind her, the footsteps grew louder, unhurried, confident, because they knew there was nowhere left for her to go. She spun, pressing her back to the wall, and that was when she saw him. A man stood beneath the amber glow of a broken street lamp, alone, unbothered by the storm soaking through his dark coat. He wasn't looking at her. He was simply standing there, hands in his pockets, as if the rain had personally agreed not to touch him. Something about his stillness made her chest ache with a strange, inexplicable relief. The kind you feel when you see a lighthouse from a sinking boat, even if you don't know yet whether it will save you. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply moved, crossing the space between them in 3 desperate strides, and grabbed the lapel of his coat with both trembling hands. "Please," she gasped, her voice cracking, rain and tears indistinguishable on her face. "Please, just pretend to love me. Just for a minute. Please, I'm begging you. Just hold me. Just pretend. They can't see me alone. They can't." The 2 men rounded the corner behind her, and she felt the stranger's arm come around her waist before she even finished the sentence, pulling her against his chest with a firmness that made the whole world tilt sideways. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what was happening. He simply lowered his head as if he'd known her for years, as if this had always been the plan, and pressed his lips to her temple, murmuring against her wet hair loud enough for the approaching men to hear. "There you are, love. I told you not to run off in the rain." Amara froze, every nerve in her body screaming with confusion and terror, and something else she didn't have time to name. Desmond's men slowed, exchanging a look. The taller one, a scarred man named Gideon, who had once broken a waiter's arm for spilling wine on Desmond's shoes, narrowed his eyes. "That's Amara Voss," Gideon said, his voice flat, dangerous. "She's not yours to hold." The stranger lifted his head slowly, and for the first time Amara saw his face fully in the lamplight. He was devastatingly, unnervingly beautiful in a way that didn't belong to ordinary men. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair damp against his forehead, and eyes so pale a gray they looked almost silver in the low light. But it wasn't his beauty that made the 2 men hesitate. It was the way the air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier, the way the rain itself seemed to slow as it fell near him, as if reality had quietly agreed to bend around whatever he was. "She's my fiancée," the stranger said calmly, and something in his tone made Gideon's confident sneer falter. "Has been, for quite some time. I'm afraid your employer was misinformed." "Desmond Cole doesn't get misinformed," The second man snapped, reaching into his jacket. He gets betrayed, and people who betray him disappear. The stranger's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Amara's waist, and she felt him shift his weight, angling his body slightly in front of hers. An instinctive, ancient gesture of protection that no stranger should have had any reason to offer her. "I'd reconsider reaching for whatever's in that jacket," he said softly. "Not because I'll stop you. Because I won't." The men hesitated, some primal part of them recognizing a danger their eyes couldn't fully explain, and after a long, tense beat, Gideon muttered something under his breath and jerked his head toward the street. They retreated the way they'd come, throwing one last look over their shoulders, but they left. Amara sagged against the stranger's chest, her legs finally giving out from adrenaline and cold, and he caught her easily, effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing at all. "Thank you," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I'm sorry, I don't even know your name, I didn't know what else to do, Nikolai," he said quietly, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between amusement and an ancient, aching recognition. "And you, little bird, have no idea what you just walked into." She blinked up at him through the rain. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her face for a long moment, as though searching for something he'd been looking for a very long time, and had finally, impossibly found. Then he shrugged off his coat and settled it around her shivering shoulders. The fabric warm despite the storm, smelling faintly of cedar and something colder underneath. Something that didn't belong to any man she'd ever met. "It means," he said, "that you just asked the vampire king of this city to pretend to love you. And I don't think either of us realized how much trouble that request was about to cause." Amara stared up at him, certain she'd misheard, certain the cold and the fear had finally cracked something loose in her mind. "The what?" "You heard me," Nikolai said, and there was no humor in his voice now. Only a quiet, patient certainty, the kind of tone people used when they'd stopped expecting to be believed a long time ago. "Come, you're freezing, and Desmond's men will regroup before they report back to him. We don't have long before this street stops being safe." He guided her out of the alley with a hand at the small of her back, and despite every instinct telling her to be afraid of a stranger who spoke about vampire kings with a straight face, she found herself walking beside him without resistance. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the fact that for the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than dread crawling under her skin. A sleek black car waited at the curb, engine already running though she hadn't seen anyone start it, and Nikolai opened the door for her with the kind of old-world courtesy that felt strange and comforting all at once. Inside, the car was warm, the leather seats soft, and a driver sat silently at the wheel, never once turning to look at her, as though her presence there was the most natural thing in the world. Nikolai settled beside her, and the car pulled smoothly into the wet, glowing streets of the city. "I know how it sounds," he said finally, watching her carefully. "But you're intelligent enough not to have missed what those men were, or what they were prepared to do, and you're intelligent enough to have noticed that ordinary men do not stop reaching for a weapon because a stranger asked them nicely." Amara pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, her mind racing through the last 10 minutes, replaying the way the two men had gone still, the way the rain itself had seemed to bend quieter near him. She should have been terrified. Instead, exhaustion and relief tangled together into something closer to numb acceptance. "Even if I believed you," she said carefully, "why would you help me? You don't know me. I grabbed you off the street and asked you to lie for me." "You didn't ask me to lie," Nikolai said. "You asked me to pretend. There's a difference, though I imagine you're too tired tonight to appreciate it." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his pale eyes. "As for why, let's simply say that some debts are older than either of us, and some faces are harder to forget than others, even after a very long time. She frowned, too drained to press the strange comment further, and let her head fall back against the seat as the city blurred past the rain-streaked windows. 20 minutes later, the car turned off the main road and climbed a private drive toward a mansion set back behind iron gates and centuries-old oaks, the kind of estate that belonged in old money postcards, not in a city built on steel and shipping money. Warm light spilled from tall windows, and staff moved discreetly at the entrance, opening doors without being asked, as if her arrival had somehow already been expected. "Where are we?" she asked, stepping out into the cool night air, her bare feet aching against the gravel. "Somewhere Desmond Cole's reach does not extend," Nikolai said simply, and something in the flat certainty of his voice made her believe him more than any explanation could have. Inside, a woman appeared silently, offering warm towels and dry clothes, guiding Amara toward a private room without a single question about who she was or why she'd arrived soaked and barefoot in a stranger's coat. When Amara finally sat by a crackling fireplace, dressed in soft borrowed clothes, a cup of tea warming her hands, Nikolai stood by the window, watching the storm outside as if it answered to him personally. "You still haven't explained," she said quietly. "The Vampire King thing." He turned, and for a moment the firelight caught his eyes at an angle that made them flash an impossible luminous silver, gone as quickly as it appeared, but unmistakable. Amara's breath caught in her throat. "There are things in this world that people build entire lives around not seeing," Nikolai said. "Cities within cities. Courts older than the countries that sit on top of them. I have ruled one of them for longer than your nation has existed, Amara Voss." He said her full name with a familiarity that unsettled her, though she was certain she hadn't given it. Desmond Cole is a small, greedy man who thinks his money makes him untouchable. He does not know what he almost sold to keep himself comfortable. "Sold?" she repeated, unease crawling up her spine. "What do you mean, sold?" Nikolai's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, something dangerous flickered across his composed features. "Your engagement was never simply a business arrangement, was it? Ask yourself why a man like Cole, with every debutante in the city eager for his name, chose you specifically. Ask yourself why the contract was drawn the way it was. Ask yourself why, 3 nights ago, he began speaking to men who do not deal in ordinary currency." Amara's teacup trembled in her hands. "How do you know about that?" "Because those men work for the same syndicate that has been trying for 6 months to locate a bloodline they believe was lost decades ago," Nikolai said quietly, crossing the room to kneel in front of her chair, his silver eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest ache. "A bloodline, little bird, that I have spent nearly 2 decades searching for myself." Amara set the teacup down with unsteady hands, the warmth of the fire suddenly doing nothing to chase the chill spreading through her chest. "I don't understand. My family isn't anyone important. My mother worked as a seamstress until she died. My father left before I could walk. There's no bloodline, no secret, nothing worth 2 decades of searching." Nikolai studied her for a long moment, something almost gentle crossing his sharp features, the kind of patience reserved for breaking news too large to absorb all at once. "Your mother's name was Elena, wasn't it?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question. The teacup slipped slightly in her grip. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I knew her mother," Nikolai said. "Or rather, I knew of her. Elena Voss was the granddaughter of Isidora Reese, the last confirmed descendant of a mortal lineage my court has protected, and hunted for, and mourned the loss of for the better part of a century. A bloodline that carries something in it my kind cannot manufacture, cannot steal, cannot replicate. A resonance, a kind of blood that allows a mortal to stand beside a sovereign of the Night Court without breaking under the weight of what that means." Amara laughed, a short, disbelieving sound edged with exhaustion. You're telling me I'm some kind of what? Chosen bride for vampires? That's insane. That's actually insane. Even for tonight. I know how it sounds, he said again, and this time there was no amusement in it at all. But Beatrice Cole did not seek you out for your father's connections, Amara. Desmond's family has been quietly indebted to men far more dangerous than bankers for 3 generations. When his father discovered, through channels I am still tracing, that the Reese bloodline had resurfaced in a seamstress's daughter working double shifts in a downtown boutique, he didn't see a wife. He saw an asset, something he could hand over to erase a debt that would otherwise have cost him everything. The fire cracked and popped in the silence that followed, and Amara felt something cold and sick settle low in her stomach as pieces she'd never let herself examine too closely began sliding into place. The rushed engagement. The way Desmond's father had insisted on the marriage before her 25th birthday. The strange, unmarked men who had started appearing at family dinners in the last 6 months, watching her with an attention that had nothing to do with polite interest. The insurance policy, she whispered. The accident he was planning. That wasn't about money. No, Nikolai agreed. I imagine it was never meant to be an accident at all. A staged death would allow him to hand over a body that was never truly a body to whatever syndicate holds his debt while collecting a payout on the side. Efficient, cruel, very much in keeping with the family's reputation. His eyes darkened, the pale silver deepening towards something colder, older. I would have found you eventually, Amara. I have men searching every city on this continent. But you found me first, on a rain-soaked street, asking a stranger to pretend to love you. Fate, it seems, grew impatient with my methods. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to breathe through the vertigo of a night that had upended everything she thought she understood about her own life. So what happens now? I go back to being handed off like property, except this time it's to you instead of Desmond? Something shifted in his expression at that, a flash of something almost wounded beneath the composure. No, he said firmly. You are not property, and you will never be traded, sold, or handed anywhere as long as I draw breath, which, I should mention, is considerably longer than most men manage. What happens now is that you stay here, under my protection, for as long as it takes to ensure Desmond Cole and whoever holds his debt understand precisely what they attempted to do, and precisely what it will cost them. And the pretending? She asked quietly, meeting his gaze. Back on the street, you called me your fiancé without blinking. Was that just to get rid of them, or is there more to it? Nikolai was quiet for a long moment, his silver eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite the exhaustion dragging at every limb. In my world, he said carefully, there is an old custom. When a sovereign of the court finds the mortal his bloodline has bound him to, a formal claim must be made before witnesses to protect her from other courts, other predators, who might see an unclaimed bride as an opportunity. I made that claim tonight in front of Cole's men, without asking you, because the alternative was watching them drag you back into a marriage designed to end in your death. His jaw tightened. I am not asking you to pretend anything you do not wish to, Amara, but I will not apologize for the lie that kept you breathing. She looked at him for a long, silent moment, rain still tapping softly against the windows, the fire casting warm shadows across a face too beautiful and too dangerous to belong to anyone entirely human. Somewhere deep beneath the fear and the disbelief, something in her chest recognized him. The way you recognize a song you've never heard, but somehow already know every note of. I don't even know what I am anymore, she admitted quietly. You are exactly who you have always been, Nikolai said, reaching out to gently brush a damp strand of hair from her face, his touch far gentler than she expected from hands that had, she suspected, done considerably more violent things. You simply did not yet know how extraordinary that was. Sleep came for Amara sometime near dawn, though she didn't remember choosing to close her eyes. She woke hours later in a bedroom she didn't recognize, sunlight filtering softly through gauzy curtains, the storm from the night before nothing but a distant memory against the calm golden light of late morning. For a moment, she lay still, cataloging the unfamiliar softness of the sheets, the faint scent of cedar clinging to the pillow, before the events of the previous night crashed back into her all at once. She sat up sharply, heart hammering, and found a set of clean clothes laid neatly across a chair near the door, along with a folded note in elegant, slanted handwriting. Breakfast is waiting whenever you're ready. Take your time. Nothing in this house will hurt you. It was signed with a single initial, N, and something about the simplicity of it eased a fraction of the panic still coiled tight in her chest. She found him an hour later, on a sunlit terrace overlooking sprawling gardens, seated at a table set with more food than she'd seen in weeks, though he himself had nothing in front of him but a cup of dark coffee he didn't seem to be drinking. He rose when she approached, that same old-world courtesy from the night before, and gestured for her to sit. "You don't eat," she observed, settling into the chair across from him. "Not food?" "No," Nikolai said, a faint wry curve touching his mouth. "Though I find I enjoy watching people who do. There's something honest about hunger that survives even centuries of cynicism." Amara picked at a piece of toast, studying him in the clear light of day, searching for anything that might betray what he'd told her the night before, some visible proof of the impossible. Aside from the faint, strange stillness to him, the way he seemed to breathe out of habit rather than necessity, he looked entirely, devastatingly human. "Prove it," she said finally. "Show me. I need to see it, or I'm going to spend the rest of today convincing myself I imagined all of this." Something flickered behind his silver eyes, amusement mixed with something more cautious. "Careful what you ask for, little bird." "I'm asking," she said steadily, though her pulse betrayed her nerves. He held her gaze for a long moment, then reached across the table and, without breaking eye contact, pressed the edge of a butter knife against his own palm, drawing a thin, dark line across his skin. Amara flinched, half rising from her seat, but before she could speak, the wound sealed itself closed in seconds, the skin knitting back together as though it had never been cut at all, leaving nothing behind but a faint smear of blood already fading from red to something closer to shadow. She sat back down slowly, staring at his unmarked palm. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay, that's real." "Very," Nikolai agreed, wiping his hand with a linen napkin, entirely unbothered. "Though I'd ask you not to test that particular curiosity with anything sharper. Some wounds take longer than others, and I'd rather not frighten you further this early in the morning." A strange, disbelieving laugh escaped her, the tension in her shoulders finally cracking loose into something almost giddy with shock. "This is insane. Yesterday I was planning a wedding I didn't want, and today I'm having breakfast with a man who just healed himself in front of me and apparently thinks I'm some kind of prophecy." "Not a prophecy," Nikolai corrected gently. "A person, Amara. One I intend to protect, regardless of bloodlines or old customs, because doing so happens to be, quite unexpectedly, the thing I want most." He paused, something more careful entering his voice. "Though I understand if that is a great deal to hear from a stranger you met less than a day ago." She studied him, the sunlight catching the sharp lines of his face, and found, to her own surprise, that the fear she should have felt had quietly transformed into something else entirely, a fragile, cautious curiosity she hadn't allowed herself in years. "Tell me about the syndicate," she said instead, needing solid ground beneath the vertigo of everything else. "The ones Desmond owes. If they're the ones who wanted to use me to erase his debt, what exactly were they planning to do with me?" Nikolai's expression shifted, the warmth cooling into something harder, older, the Kessler concern, he said. A syndicate that has operated in the shadows of this city for 3 generations, trafficking in debts that ordinary banks would never touch, and collateral that ordinary law would never recognize. Desmond's grandfather borrowed from them to save a failing shipping empire. The debt has grown, compounded, and passed down like a curse ever since. When they learned what you carried in your blood, they saw an opportunity to settle 3 generations of debt in a single transaction. His jaw tightened. You would not have been sold to a marriage, Amara. You would have been sold as tribute, to whichever court was willing to pay the highest price for a Reese bloodline bride. Amara's stomach turned, the toast in her hand forgotten. And Desmond knew this. Desmond has known for months, Nikolai confirmed quietly, which is precisely why last night matters more than you understand. The moment I claimed you before his men, word will already be spreading through the concern's networks that the Reese bloodline is not only found, but bound to the sovereign of this city's night court. That claim protects you far more effectively than any lock or guard ever could. His silver eyes held hers, steady and unflinching. But it also means Desmond Cole and the men he answers to now have every reason to try to undo it, before the claim becomes irreversible. Irreversible how? She asked carefully. Nikolai was quiet for a long moment, the morning breeze stirring the gardens beyond the terrace. There is a ceremony, he said finally, old and binding, and not without its own risks. But we will discuss that when you are ready, little bird. For now, eat your breakfast. Today, at least, you are safe. The safety, however, lasted only until early afternoon. Amara was walking through the mansion's east gallery, trailing her fingers along the spines of old leather-bound books she couldn't read, when raised voices echoed from somewhere below, sharp and urgent in a way that made her stomach clench with instinctive dread. She found the staircase and descended cautiously, following the sound to the grand foyer, where Nikolai stood facing a woman Amara had never seen before, dressed in a severe charcoal suit, flanked by 2 men who carried themselves with the same unnatural stillness Nikolai did. Cannot simply claim a rice bride without the court's confirmation, Nikolai, the woman was saying, her voice clipped and cold. The council will demand proof of resonance before they recognize any claim, regardless of how dramatically you announced it to a pair of Cole's mercenaries. The council can demand whatever it likes, Seraphine Nikolai replied, his tone deceptively calm, though Amara could see the tension coiled tight in his shoulders. The claim stands. The resonance will confirm itself, as it always does. Seraphine's sharp eyes flicked toward the staircase and landed on Amara, cataloging her with the kind of cool, assessing stare usually reserved for objects rather than people. So this is her, she said. I confess, I expected someone who looked less like she'd wandered out of a discount department store. Amara bristled despite the fear tightening her chest, refusing to let the woman's contempt show that it landed. I'm sorry. Were we introduced? Because I don't recall inviting your opinion on my wardrobe. Something flickered across Nikolai's mouth, dangerously close to a smile, before he smoothed it away and stepped between them, angling his body slightly in front of Amara in that same instinctive protective gesture from the night before. Seraphine sits on the Night Court's council, he said evenly. She's here to inform me, rather unnecessarily, that my claim will be contested unless I can prove the bond is genuine. And if you can't? Amara asked, unease creeping into her voice. Then the council reassigns you, Seraphine said flatly, to whichever sovereign among the 12 courts offers the strongest bid for an unbound Reese bride. Nikolai's claim, sentimental as it is, means very little without proof. Her gaze slid back to Nikolai, something almost pitying in it now. You know how this ends if you're wrong about her. You've been wrong before. The words landed like a blow, and Amara watched something shudder behind Nikolai's eyes, quick and controlled, but not quick enough that she missed it. "Leave us, Seraphine," he said quietly. "The council will have their proof soon enough." Seraphine studied him a moment longer, then inclined her head with mocking formality and swept out through the front doors, her two silent companions trailing behind her like shadows. The heavy doors closed with a soft final click, and the foyer fell into a taut, uncomfortable silence. "What did she mean?" Amara asked carefully. "That you've been wrong before?" Nikolai exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair, the composed mask slipping just slightly to reveal something tired and old beneath it. 18 years ago, he said, I believed I had found a Reese descendant in a woman named Catherine. I was wrong. The resonance failed, publicly, before the entire council, and the woman I claimed died within the year, caught in the crossfire of courts who saw my error as an opportunity to challenge my sovereignty. His jaw tightened. I have not made a claim since. Until last night. Amara felt something twist in her chest, sympathy tangled uncomfortably with fear. And if I'm not what you think I am, if the resonance, or whatever it's called, fails again, then the council will not simply let the matter rest, Nikolai said quietly. They will see it as proof that my judgment cannot be trusted, and they will use it to challenge everything I've built here, everything I've protected for centuries. And you, little bird, will become a prize for whichever court moves fastest to claim what I could not hold. The weight of it settled over her slowly, the understanding that she wasn't only fighting for her own life anymore, but had become, without asking for it, the center of a war she didn't fully understand, between powers older than the city itself. How do we prove it then? She asked, studying her voice. The resonance. Nikolai was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Something between hope and fear held carefully in check. There is a ritual, he said finally. Old and simple in its mechanics, though not in its consequences. A single drop of my blood mingled with yours before witnesses. If the bloodline is true, the resonance will show itself immediately, undeniably, in a way no council can dispute. And if it's not true, then the mingling will do nothing at all, he said quietly. No harm, no visible failure beyond silence where there should have been light. Only the quiet, humiliating proof that I was wrong to hope. Amara looked at him for a long moment. This ancient, powerful, strangely gentle man who had pulled her out of the rain and asked nothing of her except the truth of who she was, and felt something in her chest settle into a decision she hadn't expected to make so quickly. Do it, she said. Whatever this ritual is, I'd rather know than keep wondering. Something flickered across Nikolai's face. Relief and terror knotted together in equal measure, and he reached for her hand. The ritual room was smaller than Amara expected, tucked behind a hidden door in the mansion's lower level, its walls lined with old stone rather than the polished modern surfaces of the rest of the estate. Candles burned in iron sconces, casting flickering gold light across a circular table at the center of the room, and Nikolai's staff, along with 2 members of his personal guard, stood silently along the walls. Witnesses summoned on short notice for something that clearly mattered far more than the casual explanation he'd given her upstairs. You don't have to do this today, Nikolai said quietly, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles as they stood before the table. The council's demand can wait a week, a month, if you need time. I don't need time, Amara said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. 24 hours ago she'd been running barefoot through the rain from a man who'd planned her death for insurance money. Now, she stood in a candlelit room, about to find out whether an ancient bloodline ran through her veins, and the strangest part of the entire night was that this, somehow, felt less frightening than her old life had. Nikolai nodded, something like pride flickering behind his eyes, and withdrew a small silver blade from inside his coat, ceremonial in design, its edge thin and precise. "This will only sting for a moment," he said, and drew the blade lightly across his own palm first, a thin line of dark blood welling immediately to the surface. He held his hand out to her, palm up, and Amara, steadying her breath, extended her own hand for him to make the same small cut. The blade was sharp enough that she barely felt it. A brief, clean sting followed by the warm slide of blood along her palm. Nikolai pressed his cut hand against hers, their blood mingling between their palms, and for a moment, nothing happened at all. The candles flickered. The staff along the walls watched in silence. Amara felt a flush of humiliating disappointment rise in her chest, certain the ritual had failed, certain she was about to watch centuries of hope drain out of Nikolai's face. Then, the room changed. It began as warmth, spreading from her palm up through her arm, gentle at first, then blooming into something bright and undeniable, a soft, golden light emanating from where their hands were joined, illuminating the stone walls in a glow that had nothing to do with the candles burning around them. Amara gasped, staring down at their joined hands, at the light pulsing steadily between them like a heartbeat made visible, and heard the sharp intake of breath from every witness in the room. The resonance, one of the guards murmured, awestruck. "I've never seen it this strong." Nikolai's face, when Amara looked up, had transformed entirely. The careful composure shattered into something raw and unguarded, wonder and relief, and something achingly close to love, all tangled together in his silver eyes. "Amara," he breathed, as if her name itself was something sacred he'd been afraid to say aloud. You're truly her. The bloodline is true." The golden light faded slowly, leaving behind only the warm glow of candlelight and the faint, tingling memory of warmth still humming beneath Amara's skin. She looked down at her palm, the small cut already healed, no trace of blood or wound remaining, and felt something settle deep in her chest. A certainty she couldn't fully explain but recognized instantly as true. She belonged here. Impossibly, improbably, she belonged exactly here. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, still holding his hand, unwilling yet to let go. "Now," Nikolai said, his voice rough with an emotion he wasn't bothering to hide anymore, "the council has their proof, and no one, not Seraphine, not the other courts, not the Kessler concern, can contest my claim to you. You are protected under the oldest laws my kind recognizes. Amara, untouchable." His jaw tightened, something colder and more dangerous surfacing beneath the warmth. "Which means it's time I paid Desmond Cole the visit I promised." Amara's stomach tightened at the mention of his name, old fear resurfacing even through the strange, golden calm still settled in her chest. "What are you going to do to him?" "Nothing yet that you need concern yourself with," Nikolai said, though the promise in his voice was anything but gentle. "Tonight you rest, and you let what happened here settle. Tomorrow we discuss the Kessler concern, and how deeply their roots have grown into Desmond's family, and how thoroughly I intend to pull them out." He lifted her healed hand and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "But know this, little bird, whatever debts Desmond believed he could pay with your life are about to become debts he pays with everything he has left." She should have felt fear at the promise in his voice, the cold, ancient violence coiled just beneath his composure. Instead, standing in the fading golden light of a ritual that had rewritten everything she thought she knew about herself, Amara felt something closer to fierce, unfamiliar satisfaction. For 2 years she had swallowed her fear and her fury in equal measure, told to be grateful for a marriage designed to end her. Now, for the first time, someone else was furious on her behalf, and the storm that fury was about to unleash was one she found herself, quietly, wanting to witness. Sleep came easier that night, though Amara woke twice to the quiet, distant sound of voices below her window, low and urgent, discussing things she couldn't fully make out through the glass. By the time she made her way downstairs the next morning, the mansion had transformed into something closer to a war room than a private estate. Maps of the city were spread across the long dining table, red markers circling addresses she didn't recognize, and Nikolai stood at the head of the table alongside two men she hadn't met, both dressed in the same understated, expensive black as his personal guard. "This is Rurik," Nikolai said, gesturing to the taller of the two, a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting through one eyebrow. "He oversees my court's intelligence network. And this is Dashiell, who handles matters requiring a more delicate touch." Amara studied the maps, the careful annotations, the small photographs pinned beside certain addresses. One of them, she realized with a cold jolt, was of Desmond, caught mid-conversation outside a downtown office building she didn't recognize. "You've been watching him for 18 hours, Rurik confirmed, his voice clipped and professional. "Since the Sovereign's claim went public within the courts, Cole has met with 3 separate representatives of the Kessler concern since yesterday evening, each meeting shorter and more agitated than the last. They're panicking," Dashiell added, a faint, humorless smile touching his mouth. "A claimed Reese bride under a Sovereign's protection is not a debt they can simply write off. They're trying to determine whether it's still possible to salvage their arrangement with Cole before word spreads further." Nikolai's expression darkened. His hands braced against the table's edge, which means we move before they decide their best option is to eliminate the loose end entirely. He looked up, meeting Amara's eyes across the room. "You, specifically." Amara's pulse quickened, old fear resurfacing despite the strange safety of the mansion around her. "Eliminate me how?" "An accident," Rurik said bluntly, before Nikolai could soften the answer. "The same kind Cole was already planning before you ran. Except now it would serve 2 purposes, erasing the debt they can no longer collect, and removing the proof that undermines every claim they've made to Desmond's family for 3 generations." The room fell silent, the weight of the plan settling heavily over the table. Amara wrapped her arms around herself, staring down at the small red circle marking an address she now understood was somewhere dangerous, somewhere connected to men who had already decided her death was worth more to them than her life. "So what do we do?" "We do not wait for them to act," Nikolai said, his voice carrying the same cold, ancient authority she'd heard the night he tore through Cole's men in the alley. "Rurik has confirmed the Kessler concern's primary ledger, the physical documentation of every debt they hold, including 3 generations of the Cole family's obligations, is kept in a private vault beneath their downtown office. If that ledger is destroyed or seized, their leverage over Desmond disappears entirely, along with any claim on you." "And if we simply take the ledger," Amara said slowly, understanding dawning, "Desmond has nothing left to offer them, no debt to pay off, which means he becomes entirely, uselessly expendable to them," Dashiell finished, something satisfied in his tone. "The concern doesn't waste resources on men who can no longer serve a purpose." Nikolai crossed the room and took Amara's hands in his silver eyes steady and certain, in a way that eased some of the tight fear still coiled in her chest. "Tonight, Rurik and Dashiell move on the vault. Tomorrow, I intend to make a personal visit to Desmond Cole, one he will not soon forget." His jaw tightened, old fury simmering just beneath the surface of his calm. He believed he could trade your life to erase his family's sins. "I intend to make certain he understands, in excruciating detail, exactly how wrong that calculation was. I want to be there," Amara said suddenly, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "When you go to him. I want to see his face when he realizes it didn't work." Nikolai studied her for a long moment, something between concern and fierce, quiet pride crossing his features. "It will not be safe, Amara. Desmond is a cornered animal, and cornered animals are unpredictable. I spent 2 years being told what was safe for me by men who were planning my death the entire time, Amara said, meeting his gaze without flinching. I think I've earned the right to decide that for myself now. Something shifted in Nikolai's expression, a slow, deliberate softening that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition, as though he were seeing, clearly for the first time, exactly who she was becoming beneath the exhaustion and the trauma of the last 2 days. Very well, he said quietly. Tomorrow, you'll stand beside me when I pay Desmond Cole the visit I promised. But tonight, little bird, you rest. Tomorrow is going to require every bit of strength you have left. The vault operation, Amara learned the next morning, had gone exactly as planned. Rurik returned just before dawn with a heavy leather satchel containing the Kessler concern's private ledgers, 3 generations of debts, threats, and quiet violence, documented in meticulous, damning detail. Nikolai spread the pages across the dining table as morning light filtered through the tall windows, tracing a finger down columns of names and figures that read like a map of exactly how deep the Cole family's corruption ran. Here, Nikolai said, tapping a page near the bottom of the stack. Desmond's father, borrowing against the shipping empire 22 years ago. And here, he flipped forward several pages. Desmond himself, 6 months ago, offering something far more valuable than money as collateral against the remaining debt. He looked up at Amara, something grim settling over his features. Your name is written here, Amara, in his own hand. He didn't stumble into this arrangement. He negotiated it. Amara stared down at the page, at her own name written in unfamiliar handwriting beside a dollar figure that made her stomach turn. The cold, clinical proof that the man she'd almost married had calculated her worth down to the exact number. Something hardened in her chest, the last fragile threads of guilt or doubt about what she was about to do burning away entirely. Then let's go, she said quietly. I'm ready. They arrived at Desmond's downtown penthouse just past noon, Nikolai's black car sliding silently to the curb outside a glass tower that Amara had once, in another life, imagined living in as his wife. Rurik and Dashiell flanked them as they entered, though Nikolai moved through the building's security with an ease that suggested every guard and doorman had already been quietly, thoroughly convinced not to interfere. They found Desmond in his private office on the top floor, phone pressed to his ear, mid-argument with someone Amara suspected was a very unhappy representative of the Kessler concern. He turned as the door opened, his face draining of color the instant he saw Amara standing beside Nikolai, alive, unharmed, and very clearly no longer afraid of him. I'll call you back, Desmond said sharply into the phone, hanging up without waiting for a response. He straightened his jacket, forcing a composure that didn't reach his eyes. Amara, you're alive. I was told you were told I'd been sold to whichever court paid the highest price for me. Amara said, her voice steady despite the tremor still hidden beneath it. You were told your debt was erased, and that I'd disappear quietly enough that no one would ever ask questions. She stepped further into the room, watching him flinch at every word. I'm sure it was very disappointing to learn otherwise. Desmond's eyes darted to Nikolai, recognition and terror sparking simultaneously as he clearly placed the face from whatever descriptions had reached him through the syndicate's panicked channels over the last 2 days. You, he breathed. You're the one who claimed her, Nikolai finished calmly, stepping forward with the same lethal, unhurried grace Amara remembered from the alley. Formally, publicly, and irrevocably, under laws considerably older than your family's fortune. Which means, Mr. Cole, that your arrangement with the Kessler concern regarding Amara's future is no longer merely broken. It is void, retroactively, along with any leverage they held over you as a result of it. Desmond's jaw clenched, some last, desperate arrogance flaring beneath the fear. You have no idea what you've done. The concern doesn't simply let debts disappear. They'll come for you both. They will find, Nikolai said, setting the leather satchel of ledgers down on Desmond's desk with a heavy, deliberate thud, that their entire operations documentation has already left their possession. Every debt, every threat, every quiet arrangement made in shadow rooms over the last 3 generations now sits in my care instead of theirs. I imagine, once they discover this, their priorities will shift rather dramatically away from you and towards simply surviving the conversation I intend to have with them next. The color drained further from Desmond's face as understanding dawned, the full weight of what Nikolai had just done settling over him. You took the ledgers. My debt, it's not documented anywhere now. Which means the concern has no reason left to protect you, or tolerate you, or extend you any further patience, Nikolai finished, something cold and satisfied threading through his voice. You are, Miska, Cole, entirely on your own now. No debt to leverage. No collateral to offer. Simply a man who tried to sell his fiancée to monsters and failed. Amara watched Desmond's carefully constructed world crumble in real time, watched 2 years of fear and quiet cruelty collapse into something small and desperate in front of her, and felt for the first time since she'd overheard his phone call 3 nights ago, something that finally resembled peace. Amara, Desmond said, his voice shifting suddenly, pleading in a way she'd never once heard from him in 2 years of engagement. You know this wasn't personal. It was business, family obligations, things you don't understand. I never wanted to hurt you. You planned my death, Amara said flatly. You took out an insurance policy on my life and negotiated my worth to a criminal syndicate like I was a line item on a balance sheet. Don't stand there and tell me it wasn't personal, Desmond. It was the most personal thing anyone has ever done to me. He flinched, and for a moment something like genuine shame flickered across his features before the fear swallowed it whole again. What do you want? Money? I can give you money. Whatever amount I don't want your money, Amara cut in, something fierce and unshakable steadying her voice in a way it never had during 2 years of quietly enduring his family's contempt. I want you to understand exactly what it feels like to be powerless. To have your entire future decided by people who see you as nothing but a number on a page. She glanced at Nikolai, then back at Desmond. I want you to feel, even for a fraction of a moment, what those 3 nights felt like for me, running through the rain, because the alternative was trusting men who'd already decided I was worth more dead than alive. Nikolai stepped forward then, his presence filling the room with that same suffocating, ancient pressure Amara remembered from the alley, and Desmond visibly shrank back against his desk. You will not be harmed, Mr. Cole, Nikolai said quietly, though the promise in his voice carried its own kind of violence. Amara has decided that death is a mercy you do not deserve. Instead, you will live, entirely stripped of the protection your family's fortune once bought you. The Kessler concern will learn, within the hour, that their ledgers are gone, and that the man who negotiated away his fiancée to erase his debts no longer has anything left to offer them. His eyes glinted, cold and merciless. I imagine they will not be forgiving of the inconvenience you've caused them. You're leaving me to them, Desmond breathed, horror dawning across his face. Without the debt, without collateral, they'll do precisely what you were prepared to let them do to Amara, Nikolai said, something almost gentle in the brutality of the observation. Perhaps you'll finally understand, in whatever time you have left, exactly what it felt like for her to sit across from you at that rehearsal dinner, smiling, while you'd already decided her fate. Desmond's legs seemed to give slightly, and he caught himself against the edge of his desk, all the practiced arrogance of 2 years finally, completely gone, leaving behind only a frightened, desperate man, staring down the consequences of his own greed. Amara watched him for a long moment, waiting to feel something like satisfaction or vindication or even simple relief. Instead, what she felt was something quieter, steadier. Closure, goodbye, Desmond, she said finally, turning away from him without waiting for a response, and found she meant it entirely. No lingering fear, no unfinished business, nothing left of the 2 years she'd spent shrinking herself to survive his family's expectations. Nikolai fell into step beside her as they left the office, his hand finding hers with a quiet, steadying warmth, and neither of them looked back as they crossed the penthouse and stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut on Desmond Cole's ruined composure, and Amara exhaled a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 years straight. "Are you all right?" Nikolai asked quietly, studying her face as the elevator descended. "I think so," Amara said, surprised to find it was true. "I thought I'd feel more, victorious, but mostly I just feel like I can finally breathe again." "That's not nothing," Nikolai said softly, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "That, little bird, is everything." Outside, the city stretched bright and ordinary under an afternoon sun, entirely indifferent to the quiet war that had just been won inside a glass tower 30 floors above the street. Amara looked up at Nikolai, at the man who had pulled her out of the rain 3 nights ago and asked nothing of her but the truth, and felt something settle into place in her chest, steady and certain in a way nothing in her life had been for a very long time. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing the same question she'd asked him that first morning over breakfast. Nikolai was quiet for a moment as they stepped out into the sunlit street, his hand still warm around hers, the city moving indifferently around them as though nothing extraordinary had just taken place 30 floors above. "Now," he said finally, "we let the Kessler concern discover exactly what it costs to threaten someone under my protection. And you, Amara, decide what kind of life you'd like to build, now that no one can decide it for you." They didn't return immediately to the estate. Instead, Nikolai guided her toward the car and asked, quietly, whether she wanted to simply drive. No destination, no urgency, only the quiet luxury of choosing something for herself for the first time in longer than she could remember. She said yes before he'd even finished the question. They drove along the lakefront as the afternoon stretched into evening, the city's skyline catching fire with the colors of sunset. And for the first time since the rain-soaked night that had upended her entire life, Amara let herself simply exist, without fear pressing against her chest. Nikolai didn't fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. He simply sat beside her, patient and steady, offering his presence without demanding anything from her in return. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually, watching the lake turn gold and pink beyond the window. "Anything, that first night. When I grabbed you and asked you to pretend to love me, would you have helped me if I wasn't? Whatever it is I turned out to be? If the resonance had failed? If I was just an ordinary woman running from ordinary men?" Nikolai turned to look at her, something quietly fierce in his expression. "Amara, I did not know what you carried in your blood when you grabbed my coat in that alley. I knew only that a terrified young woman had run to me, barefoot and soaked through, begging for the smallest mercy of pretense to survive one more moment. The bloodline, the resonance, none of that mattered in the instant I chose to hold you. I would have done precisely the same for anyone who asked." Something in her chest ached at the simple, unguarded honesty of it, the realization that the man beside her hadn't saved her because of who her ancestors were, but because of who she was, in that single, desperate moment on a rain-soaked street. That's a very good answer," she said softly, her voice thick with an emotion she didn't try to hide. "It's simply the truth," Nikolai said, reaching over to gently tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering against her cheek. "Though I confess, once I recognized what you carried, once I understood who you truly were, the feeling that had already begun the moment you asked me to pretend, became something considerably less pretend on my end. Amara turned to face him fully, the last of the sunset painting warm light across his sharp, beautiful features. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Nikolai said quietly, "that I have spent nearly 2 decades searching for a bloodline I believed I owed a debt of protection to. What I did not expect, what I could not have prepared myself for, was finding a woman I would have chosen regardless of blood or duty or ancient obligation. You asked me to pretend to love you, Amara, I find, rather inconveniently for a man who has spent centuries guarding his heart, that I am no longer pretending at all." The words settled over her like warmth after a long cold, and Amara felt something in her chest crack open, not with fear this time, but with a fragile, cautious hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "Trust someone. The last man who told me he'd take care of me was planning my death behind my back." "I am not Desmond Cole," Nikolai said, something fierce and certain in his voice. "I do not need your inheritance, your bloodline, or your silence. I ask nothing of you, Amara, except a chance to prove, every day for as long as you'll allow it, that some men mean it when they say they'll protect you." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, the last light of the sunset fading into the soft blue of early evening, and found that the fear she expected to feel simply wasn't there. In its place was something steadier, something that felt, impossibly, like the beginning of a life she actually wanted to live. "Okay," she said softly. "Prove it then." Nikolai's answering smile was slow, warm, and entirely unguarded, the first truly unrestrained expression she'd seen cross his face since the night they met. "It would be my honor, little bird." The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet, steady rhythm Amara had never known was possible. The Kessler concern, stripped of its ledgers and its leverage, fractured under the combined pressure of Nikolai's court and its own panicked internal power struggles, its remaining members scattering to smaller, less ambitious operations far from the city Nikolai ruled. Word spread quickly through the hidden courts that a Reese bloodline had not only been found, but claimed, protected, and thoroughly avenged, and the whispers that once might have painted Amara as prey now spoke of her with a wary, unmistakable respect. Desmond Cole, she learned through Rurik's quiet updates, disappeared from the city entirely within a month, his family's fortune seized by creditors once the syndicate's protection evaporated, his name reduced to a cautionary whisper among the same social circles that had once toasted his engagement. Amara found she felt nothing when she heard the news. No lingering anger, no satisfaction. Only the quiet, settled peace of a chapter fully closed. She spent her mornings now in the mansion's sunlit gallery, no longer trailing her fingers uselessly along books she couldn't read, but working alongside Rurik's intelligence team. Her sharp memory for detail and her years of quiet observation in Desmond's world proving unexpectedly valuable in untangling the remaining threads of the concern's collapsed operations. Nikolai had offered her, without hesitation, whatever place in his court she wanted, and she had surprised them both by choosing to work rather than simply exist as a claimed bride behind protected walls. "You could have anything," Nikolai said one evening, watching her pore over a stack of financial records with the same focus she'd once reserved for surviving each day of her old life. "Any life you wanted, Amara, and you've chosen paperwork." "I've chosen purpose," Amara corrected, not looking up from the page in front of her. "For 2 years I wasn't allowed to want anything for myself. I think I'd like to spend a while figuring out what that actually feels like before I decide what kind of life I want to build." Something warm and proud crossed Nikolai's face at that, and he settled into the chair across from her without argument, content simply to be near her while she worked. It was a small thing, she thought, this quiet, patient presence, but it was also, she was slowly realizing, everything Desmond had never once offered her in 2 years of engagement. Their relationship deepened slowly, deliberately, neither of them rushing toward promises neither was ready to make. Nikolai took her through the city he'd ruled for centuries, showed her hidden gardens and quiet rooftop terraces that belonged to no map, told her stories of a world she was only beginning to understand, careful always to let her set the pace of how much closeness she was ready to accept. He never once pressed her toward the old customs Seraphine had spoken of that first day, never demanded the deeper, more permanent bonds his kind sometimes required of claimed brides. He simply stayed, steady and patient, exactly as he'd promised he would. It was nearly 2 months later, on a quiet evening on the terrace where they'd first shared breakfast, that Amara finally understood how completely her life had transformed. She sat across from Nikolai as the sun set over the gardens, a stack of files from that day's work finally set aside, and found herself simply watching him, memorizing the sharp lines of his face in the fading light, the quiet stillness that had once frightened her now feeling like the safest thing she'd ever known. "What are you thinking?" Nikolai asked, catching her studying him. "That 3 months ago, I was planning a wedding I didn't want, to a man who was planning my death," Amara said quietly. "And now I'm sitting here, safe, working, building something that actually feels like a life. I keep waiting to feel like it's too good to be true, like something's going to come and take it away again." Nikolai reached across the table, taking her hand in his silver eyes steady and warm in the fading light. "Nothing is going to take this from you, Amara. Not the concern, not the council, not anyone foolish enough to try. You are under my protection, yes, but more than that, you are simply, entirely, my choice. Every day, freely made, not because of blood or duty, but because I cannot imagine choosing anyone else." Tears pricked at her eyes, warm and unexpected, and she found herself smiling in a way that felt entirely unguarded for the first time since her mother had died. "I asked a stranger on the street to pretend to love me," she said softly. "I never imagined it would turn into this." "Neither did I," Nikolai admitted, lifting her hand to press a soft kiss against her palm, exactly where the ritual's small scar had long since healed without a trace. "But I find, little bird, that I am considerably more grateful for that rainstorm than I ever expected to be." 6 months after the night Amara had run barefoot through a Chicago rainstorm, the mansion's gardens were filled with lantern light and quiet music. A small, private gathering of Nikolai's court assembled beneath the old oaks to witness something Amara had once believed impossible for herself, a beginning chosen entirely on her own terms. There had been no pressure, no ancient obligation forcing her hand, only months of steady, patient devotion, and a slow, certain understanding that what had begun as a desperate lie on a rain-soaked street had become the truest thing she'd ever known. Seraphine stood among the small crowd of witnesses, her sharp, assessing gaze considerably softer than it had been the day she'd questioned whether Amara was worth the trouble Nikolai's claim had caused. Rurik and Dashiel stood near the back, along with the household staff who had cared for Amara that first frightened morning, without ever asking a single unnecessary question. It was a small gathering, intimate rather than grand, exactly as Amara had asked for. She wore no elaborate gown, no diamond crest signaling royal status, only a simple ivory dress that felt entirely her own, chosen without anyone else's expectations weighing on the decision. Nikolai waited for her beneath the largest oak, dressed in dark, understated elegance, his silver eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered concealing from anyone watching. "You look terrified," he murmured as she reached him, humor threading gently through his voice. "I'm not terrified," Amara said, smiling despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I think I've simply never done anything before that I actually wanted, without someone else deciding it for me first. It feels strange, choosing something purely because it's right for me." "Then, let it feel strange," Nikolai said softly, taking her hands in his. "And let it also feel like exactly what it is, the first of many choices, freely made, for the rest of whatever life we build together. The small ceremony that followed was simple, unburdened by the old customs of his kind, exactly as Amara had asked. There was no binding ritual, no formal declaration before the full council, only quiet, honest vows exchanged beneath lantern light, promises built not on ancient bloodlines or obligation, but on the steady, patient devotion that had carried them both from that first desperate night to this quiet garden 6 months later. When Nikolai finally kissed her, soft and unhurried beneath the old oak trees, Amara felt none of the fear that had once defined every major decision of her old life. There was only warmth and certainty and the quiet, settled knowledge that she had finally, fully, become someone who got to choose her own future. Later, as the small gathering dispersed into quiet conversation and soft laughter beneath the lanterns, Amara found herself standing alone for a moment at the edge of the garden, looking back at the mansion that had once felt like an impossible fairy tale, and now simply felt like home. Nikolai found her there, slipping an arm around her waist, following her gaze toward the warm, glowing windows of the house. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "Only one," Amara said, leaning into him with a soft, contented smile. "That I didn't run into you sooner." Nikolai laughed, low and warm, pressing a kiss into her hair. "Little bird, I searched for nearly 2 decades to find you. I think, all things considered, the timing worked out exactly as it needed to." She turned in his arms to face him fully, the lantern light catching the same silver eyes that had once frozen her in place on a rain-soaked street, now looking back at her with nothing but warmth and devotion. "Thank you," she said softly, for pretending, that first night, for giving me a reason to believe, even for just a moment, that someone might actually choose to protect me. "I told you once," Nikolai murmured, resting his forehead gently against hers, "that I was not entirely pretending, even that very first night. I simply hadn't yet found the courage to admit it." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes fully, his voice steady with quiet, unwavering certainty. "You are not a debt paid, Amara, or a bloodline restored, or a claim proven before a council. You are simply, entirely, the choice I will make every single day for the rest of both our lives." That was never pretend, not for one single moment. Amara smiled, tears of quiet, overwhelming happiness slipping unbidden down her cheeks, and pulled him down into a kiss beneath the lantern light, finally fully certain that the desperate lie she'd begged a stranger to tell on a rain-soaked street had somehow, impossibly, become the truest and safest thing she had ever known.